3 teams. 12 months. 0 explanations. That's the nightmare Diamond DeShields woke up to when she realized her WNBA career wasn't just struggling, it was being systematically dismantled without a single person in power ever saying her name. No press release. No formal statement. No termination letter with an official signature. Just silence. The kind of silence that destroys careers while everyone watches and nobody says a word. Here's what makes this story different from every other roster move you've seen this season. DeShields didn't lose her spot because she couldn't play. She didn't get cut because her numbers dropped or her body broke down. She got erased because of what happened on August 30th, 2024, and the pattern that led up to it. But before I show you exactly what went down that night at Wintrust Arena, you need to understand something crucial about the modern WNBA. Something the league will never admit publicly. They don't need to ban anyone anymore. They don't need suspensions, fines, or public discipline. Because in 2024, there's a system in place that does all that work quietly, invisibly, and with complete deniability. It's called the market. And once you understand how it actually operates behind closed doors, everything about DeShields, Kennedy Carter, and even Cheryl Swoopes suddenly makes terrifying sense. These women didn't just lose their jobs. They became examples. And Caitlin Clark? She was at the center of all of it, without ever needing to say a single word. Let's rewind. August 30th, 2024. Indiana Fever versus Chicago Sky. Wintrust Arena was packed, but the energy felt different that night. Heavier. Like everyone knew something was building but couldn't name it yet. The Fever were dominating. This game would end 100-81, a blowout by any standard. Caitlin Clark was doing what Caitlin Clark does. Moving at full speed, commanding the floor, pulling defenders out of position with nothing but gravity. And then came the play that changed everything. Aaliyah Boston threw a pass on the fast break. Clark caught it mid-stride, accelerating toward the basket. DeShields was tracking her, but not the way defenders normally track a player. She wasn't watching the ball. She wasn't reading the play. Her eyes were locked on Clark's body. Her shoulder was already dropping before the contact even happened. And when she connected, it wasn't basketball. It was impact. Clark hit the floor hard. The kind of fall that makes an entire arena go quiet for half a second before the noise explodes. The refs blew the whistle. Called it a common foul. No review. No upgrade. Just a basic call and a free throw opportunity. But here's what the officials didn't realize in that moment. The cameras had already captured everything. The positioning. The intent. The frame-by-frame evidence that this wasn't a defensive rotation gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Within hours, that clip would spread across every sports platform on the internet. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. Analysts breaking down the footage like it was a crime scene. And in the front offices of every WNBA team, a very different conversation was starting. One that would cost DeShields everything. The WNBA reviewed the footage overnight. By the next morning, the call had been upgraded. Flagrant 1. Official. Documented. Permanent. But here's the thing about official upgrades. They only tell you what happened. They don't tell you why it mattered so much. Because that hit on August 30th wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the climax. See, when analysts started breaking down the footage, something unexpected emerged. This wasn't the first time DeShields had made contact with Clark that felt different. And it wasn't the second time either. Throughout the entire 2024 season, every single time the Fever and the Sky shared the court, there was a pattern. A rhythm of physicality that went beyond normal defensive intensity. Hard closeouts that arrived late, after Clark had already released the ball. Body checks during cuts that had nothing to do with positioning. Off-ball contact that cameras caught but refs missed. Play after play. Game after game. The same 2 players. The same type of impact. This is what the front offices saw when they pulled the tape. Not just one moment of poor judgment, but a documented history of targeted physicality against the most marketable player the WNBA had seen in decades. And that's when the math started working against DeShields. You have to understand something about the economics of professional women's basketball right now. The WNBA is experiencing the biggest growth surge in its entire history. Viewership is up. Attendance is up. Sponsorship deals are multiplying. And at the center of that explosion is one player, Caitlin Clark. She's not just a point guard. She's a revenue generator, a broadcast ratings guarantee. The reason networks are suddenly paying attention to games they used to ignore. When you threaten that asset, when you put hands on the golden goose repeatedly and publicly, you're not just committing a foul. You're threatening the financial future of the entire league. Now, did any WNBA executive ever say that out loud? Of course not. That would require honesty, and honesty doesn't protect billion-dollar investments. Instead, something quieter happened. Something you'd miss if you weren't paying very close attention. The Chicago Sky moved first. Within weeks of that August 30th game, DeShields' minutes started disappearing. Rotation spots that had been hers for years suddenly went to other players. Her role shrank game by game until she was barely seeing the floor. Then came the waiver notice. Standard language. Boilerplate phrases about roster direction and team strategy. The same words every front office uses when they want to cut someone without creating headlines. Clark's name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the paperwork. It didn't need to be. Everyone involved knew exactly what this was about. DeShields went to social media. She posted about packing her life into a rental car, about driving back to Atlanta alone, about the weight of suddenly being without a team, without a plan, without any explanation that made sense to anyone watching from the outside. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn, because DeShields wasn't done. Not yet. Another team stepped forward. A team with championship aspirations. A team that should have known better. The New York Liberty signed her. And what happened next would prove that the market wasn't finished sending its message. On paper, the Liberty signing made perfect sense. New York was in the middle of a championship push. They needed wing depth. DeShields had all-star credentials and playoff experience. The basketball logic checked every box. But basketball logic isn't what runs this league anymore. What runs this league is optics, sponsorships, television contracts, and the unspoken understanding that certain players are protected assets, whether anyone admits it publicly or not. The Liberty front office either didn't understand that reality, or they thought they could navigate around it. They were wrong. DeShields arrived in New York with something to prove. This was supposed to be her redemption arc. A chance to show the league that one controversial moment, one upgraded flagrant, didn't define her entire career. She practiced hard. She showed up early. She did everything a professional is supposed to do when they're fighting for their place in the league. But the minutes never came. Game after game, DeShields sat. Her rotation spots were limited to garbage time. Those final minutes when the outcome is already decided and the starters are resting. The meaningful minutes, the ones that actually matter, went to other players. Coaches spoke in generalities when asked about her role. We're still figuring out rotations. Everyone's competing for spots. It's a process. The same empty phrases that mean nothing and everything at the same time. Meanwhile, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something that wouldn't become public until much later. Sponsors were watching. See, when you sign a controversial player, you're not just making a basketball decision. You're making a brand decision. And brands have memories. They track headlines. They measure risk. DeShields came with baggage now. Not the kind you can see, but the kind that shows up in marketing meetings and sponsorship negotiations. Is she the player who hit Caitlin Clark? That question followed her everywhere. Into every front office. Into every conversation about her future. And the Liberty, whether they anticipated it or not, found themselves caught between basketball needs and business realities. The result? DeShields became a roster spot, not a rotation player. A name on paper, not a presence on the court. Weeks passed. The Liberty made their playoff push. And when it came time to trim the roster for the postseason, the decision was already made before anyone sat down to discuss it. Another waiver notice. Another round of standard language. Another quiet exit with no press conference and no public explanation. 2 teams in less than 6 months. Both times the same pattern. Minutes disappearing. Roles shrinking. Then the door closing without any official reason ever being stated. But here's what makes the third cut even more disturbing than the first 2. Because after New York, DeShields found one more opportunity. One more team willing to take a chance. And what happened there would remove any doubt about whether this was coincidence or coordination. The Atlanta Dream, her hometown team, signed her. The city where she'd driven that rental car. The place she'd retreated to when everything fell apart. It should have been a homecoming. Instead, it became the final proof that Diamond DeShields had been marked by something far more powerful than any single front office decision. The market had spoken. And the market wasn't done yet. Atlanta was supposed to be different. This wasn't just another team. This was home. The city DeShields had retreated to when Chicago cut her loose. The place where her family lived, where her support system existed, where she thought she could rebuild everything that had been taken from her. The Dream signed her with all the right words. Fresh start. New opportunity. chance to contribute. But from the moment she stepped into that facility, something felt off. The coaching staff was polite but distant. Teammates were welcoming but cautious. There was an energy in the building that DeShields couldn't quite name, like everyone knew something she didn't. And they did. Because before DeShields ever put on a dream jersey, conversations had already happened. Phone calls between front offices, discussions about fit and chemistry, and all the other words executives use when they're really talking about risk management. The dream knew exactly who they were signing. They knew about the flagrant. They knew about the pattern. They knew about the sponsors who were watching every move the league made regarding Caitlin Clark. They signed her anyway, but with an unspoken understanding that her role would be limited, controlled, contained. DeShields thought she was getting a second chance. What she was actually getting was a holding pattern. Her minutes in Atlanta were even fewer than they'd been in New York. Games came and went where she never left the bench. When she did play, it was in situations so low stakes that her presence barely registered in the box score. 3 teams. Same exact pattern. Minutes vanishing. Roles evaporating. Exits arriving without explanation. At what point does coincidence become coordination? Here's what nobody in the WNBA will ever say publicly. There doesn't need to be a meeting. There doesn't need to be a memo. There doesn't need to be any documented evidence of teams agreeing to freeze someone out. The market handles it automatically. When you become a liability, when your presence on a roster creates more problems than your talent solves, the math does the work. Every front office runs the same calculations independently and arrives at the same conclusion. Too risky. Not worth it. Move on. And that's exactly what happened with DeShields. 3 times. In 12 months. But here's where this story gets bigger than one player. Because DeShields wasn't the only one who experienced this invisible system at work. She wasn't even the most high-profile example. Remember Kennedy Carter? The player who body-checked Caitlin Clark earlier in that same 2024 season. The incident that happened before DeShields' flagrant, the one that set the tone for everything that followed? Her career trajectory after that moment looks almost identical to what happened to DeShields. Minutes disappearing. Opportunities drying up. The slow, quiet erosion of a professional basketball career with no official explanation ever given. And then there's a name that carries even more weight. A legend. Someone who should have been untouchable. Cheryl Swoopes. When she made those comments about Caitlin Clark, when she publicly questioned the hype, the media coverage, the attention being poured onto a rookie, something shifted. Opportunities that had been open suddenly closed. Doors that had always been available quietly locked. 3 women. 3 different situations. One common thread. And that thread leads somewhere the WNBA desperately doesn't want you to look. Let's talk about money. Because that's what this is really about. Not basketball. Not fouls. Not even player safety. Money. The WNBA has spent nearly 3 decades fighting for survival. Low attendance. Minimal television coverage. Salaries so small that most players had to play overseas just to make a living. For years, the league was a passion project. A statement. A symbol of progress that never quite translated into financial stability. Then Caitlin Clark happened. And everything changed. Her final college game drew more viewers than the NBA Finals. Let that sink in for a moment. A women's college basketball game outperformed the biggest event in men's professional basketball. When she entered the WNBA draft, it wasn't just sports news. It was cultural news. Mainstream news. The kind of coverage that brings in audiences who've never watched a single WNBA game in their lives. Suddenly, advertisers who'd ignored women's basketball for decades were calling. Networks were renegotiating broadcast deals. Ticket prices for fever games were rivaling NBA prices in some markets. Caitlin Clark didn't just join the WNBA. She became the WNBA's entire financial future compressed into one player. And when that much money is attached to one person, protection becomes the priority. Not stated protection. Not official protection. Invisible protection. The kind that operates through market forces rather than league mandates. Here's how it works in practice. Let's say you're a team owner. You've got sponsors who are finally paying attention to women's basketball because of the Clark effect. Your broadcast numbers are up. Your merchandise sales are climbing. Now imagine one of your players does something that threatens that momentum. Something that creates negative headlines. Something that makes sponsors nervous about their association with your organization. What do? You don't need the league to tell you. You don't need a memo or a phone call or a directive from the commissioner's office. You simply make a business decision. You cut the liability. You protect the asset. You keep the money flowing. And if every other owner in the league is running the same calculation at the same time, which they are because they're all watching the same revenue numbers, then the result looks exactly like coordination without anyone ever coordinating anything. This is what happened to Diamond DeShields. Not a conspiracy. Something worse. A system so efficient that it doesn't need conspirators. It just needs everyone to understand what protects their investment and what threatens it. DeShields threatened it. So did Kennedy Carter. So did Cheryl Swoopes, in a different way but with the same result. And the market responded exactly as markets do. It eliminated the threat. But here's what makes this whole situation even more complicated, even more uncomfortable. Because while the business logic is clear, the human cost is devastating. These aren't just assets and liabilities on a spreadsheet. They're careers, their dreams, their decades of sacrifice and training and dedication being erased because of moments that lasted seconds. And the woman at the center of all of it, Caitlin Clark herself, has never once asked for any of this. Which raises a question nobody seems to want to answer. What does she actually think about what's being done in her name? Caitlin Clark has never called for anyone to be punished. Read that again. Because it matters more than anything else in this story. After the DeShields hit, Clark got up off the floor, took her free throws and kept playing. No dramatic reaction. No social media post demanding justice. No press conference calling out her attacker by name. After Kennedy Carter's hit earlier that season, same response. She got up. She kept going. After every controversial moment involving her physical safety on that court, Clark's public response was the same. Professionalism, silence, and basketball. She didn't need to say anything. Because the machine was already moving without her. And that might be the most disturbing part of this entire story. A system powerful enough to end careers, silence veterans, and reshape the future of women's basketball was operating completely independently of the person it claimed to be protecting. Clark didn't pull any levers. She didn't make any calls. She didn't whisper anything into any owner's ear. She just played basketball. But here's where the narrative gets complicated in ways that most coverage completely ignores. Because if you talk to people inside WNBA locker rooms, not on the record, not with their names attached, you hear a very different version of this story. You hear frustration that goes far deeper than one flagrant foul. Players who've spent years in this league building it brick by brick with minimal pay, minimal recognition, and minimal support suddenly watching an entire media ecosystem reshape itself around one rookie. That frustration is real, it's legitimate, and it deserves to be understood rather than dismissed. These players aren't wrong to feel the imbalance. Think about it from their perspective. Veteran players who dedicated their entire professional lives to the WNBA when nobody was watching. When cameras weren't there. When sponsors weren't calling. When ticket sales were slow and arenas were half empty. They built the foundation that Clark is now standing on. And suddenly the entire world acts like women's basketball was invented in 2024. That's a painful reality to sit with. And some players handled that pain better than others. Some channeled it into competition, into raising their own games, into using Clark's spotlight to showcase their own talents to audiences who'd never watched before. Others let the frustration spill over into something uglier, something physical, something that crossed the line between competitive intensity and targeted aggression. DeShields chose the second path, at least once, maybe more. And the consequences that followed weren't just about one flagrant foul. They were about the message her actions sent to every owner, every sponsor, every television executive who had just invested in this league's financial future. The message that women's basketball was still a place where its own players would undermine its most valuable commercial moment. That message was unacceptable. And the response was swift, quiet, and absolute. But here's the question that keeps surfacing when you really dig into this story. Was the punishment proportionate to the crime? 3 teams. 12 months. A career effectively ended while the league smiled for cameras and pretended nothing had happened. Is that justice? Or is that something else entirely? Let's talk about proportionality, because that word is at the heart of everything. One flagrant foul. Upgraded from common contact. Penalty assessed. Game continued. That's what the official record shows. But the unofficial consequence? A career dismantled across 3 organizations in 12 months. A professional athlete effectively blacklisted without a single document ever using that word. Is that proportionate? Before you answer, consider this. The WNBA has seen far worse on its courts with far smaller consequences. Players have thrown elbows that connected with faces. Hard fouls that sent people to locker rooms mid-game. Moments of physical aggression that made DeShields' hit look almost tame by comparison. Some of those players are still active today, still starting, still collecting paychecks and playoff minutes without anyone questioning their presence on a roster. So why was DeShields different? The answer isn't about the severity of the foul. It's about the target. And that distinction reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how the modern WNBA actually operates beneath its polished public surface. This league markets itself on equality, on sisterhood, on the idea that women's basketball represents something bigger than the sport itself. A statement about what women deserve in professional athletics. But what happened to DeShields exposes a hierarchy that nobody officially acknowledges. Not all players are equal in this league. They never were. But in 2024, the gap between the most valuable player and everyone else reached a scale that the sport had never seen before. Clark's rookie season broke attendance records in 17 different markets. Her games drew television ratings that doubled and sometimes tripled league averages. Sponsors who'd never touched women's basketball before were suddenly competing for association with her image. The financial distance between Clark's market value and every other player in the league wasn't just large. It was unprecedented. And unprecedented value creates unprecedented protection. Not because anyone decided to protect her specifically, but because protecting her meant protecting hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that every single owner in the league depended on. Here's where it gets even more complicated. Because that protection didn't just affect players who physically harmed Clark. It extended to anyone who threatened the narrative around her. Cheryl Swoopes didn't touch anyone. She didn't commit a foul. She didn't make physical contact with a single person. She simply said words. She questioned the media coverage. She pushed back on the narrative that Clark was changing everything. She suggested, reasonably from a historical perspective, that Clark was receiving attention that players like her never got during their own dominant eras. Those words cost her. Significantly. Broadcasting opportunities that had been available suddenly weren't. Media platforms that had welcomed her voice went quiet. The infrastructure of access that surrounds professional sports slowly closed around her. No announcement. No explanation. Just doors that used to open staying shut. If a flagrant foul gets you cut from 3 rosters, what does publicly questioning the league's golden narrative get you? The answer, apparently, is erasure of a different kind. Slower. Quieter. But just as complete. And that's the part of the story that should make every single person watching deeply uncomfortable. Because if the market punishes physical aggression and verbal dissent with equal efficiency, then what exactly are the boundaries for everyone else? Where is the line between protecting an asset and silencing legitimate voices? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, but it leads directly to something even bigger. Something that involves the league itself, the commissioner's office, and a decision that was made, or deliberately not made, that tells you everything about who really holds power in women's basketball right now. The WNBA commissioner's office watched everything unfold in real time. Every hit, every waiver notice, every social media post, every career quietly dissolving without official explanation. And they said almost nothing. Think about what that silence actually means. When the league upgraded DeShields' foul to a flagrant one, they issued a brief technical statement. Standard language. The kind of communication that checks a procedural box without actually saying anything meaningful. No follow-up statement about player safety. No press conference addressing the pattern of physical play directed at Clark throughout the 2024 season. No public acknowledgement of the broader cultural tensions building inside locker rooms across the league. Just the upgrade notification and then institutional silence. Now compare that to how the league responds when it wants the world to pay attention. Championship celebrations get full press conferences. Star signings get coordinated media rollouts. New broadcast deals get announced with carefully prepared statements designed to dominate the news cycle for days. The WNBA knows how to communicate when communication serves its interests, which means the silence around everything that happened to DeShields, Carter, and Swoopes wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. And choices made by powerful institutions always reveal priorities. Here's what that silence was actually communicating to everyone paying close attention. We don't need to address this directly. The market is handling it. And as long as the market handles it cleanly, without creating bigger headlines than the problem itself, we have no reason to intervene. That's not leadership. That's calculated abdication. And it raises a question that cuts to the core of everything this league claims to represent. If the WNBA truly stands for equality, sisterhood, and the advancement of women in professional sports, then where was that commitment when players were being quietly erased without due process or public explanation? Where was the sisterhood when veterans who built this league were watching their careers evaporate because they'd become inconvenient for someone else's business model? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Institutions protect what generates revenue. Everything else is messaging. The WNBA's silence wasn't a failure of leadership. It was leadership working exactly as designed, just designed to serve financial interests rather than players. But here's what makes this moment historically significant beyond just one season and 3 careers. The 2024 WNBA season didn't just change the league's financial trajectory. It changed the power dynamic between players and owners in ways that will take years to fully understand. Before Clark, WNBA players had significant collective leverage. The league needed them more than any individual star. No single player was so valuable that the system would reorganize itself around protecting her. After Clark, that balance shifted. For the first time in league history, one player's market value was large enough to reshape how every team made decisions. Not officially, not in any written policy, but in the invisible calculations that determine who gets minutes, who gets contracts, and who gets quietly shown the door. That's a fundamental power shift. And the players who didn't adapt to that new reality fast enough paid the price. DeShields paid it. Carter paid it. Swoopes paid it in her own way. But here's the part of this story that almost nobody is talking about. Because while these 3 women were experiencing the consequences of that power shift, something else was building underneath the surface of the league. A reaction. A reckoning. A growing awareness among players that the system had changed around them without their consent or knowledge. And what happened when that awareness finally broke into the open would change the conversation about Caitlin Clark, player safety, and the future of women's basketball forever. Something started shifting inside WNBA locker rooms around mid-season 2024. Quietly at first. The way all significant movements begin, in whispered conversations, private group chats, and closed-door meetings that never make it onto anyone's official agenda. Players were talking. Not about Caitlin Clark specifically. Not about DeShields or Carter or the flagrants or the waivers. They were talking about something bigger. Something that had been building long before Clark ever stepped onto a professional court. They were talking about what it meant to be a WNBA player in an era where one rookie's presence had fundamentally restructured the economic reality of their entire profession, without a single collective bargaining negotiation taking place. See, here's what gets lost in the Clark conversation when it focuses entirely on fouls and feuds and viral moments. The players who showed frustration toward Clark in 2024 weren't just reacting to her talent or her media coverage. They were reacting to a system that had always undervalued them, and was now demonstrating exactly how much it had always undervalued them by showing what valued actually looked like. For years, WNBA players accepted below-market salaries, overseas stints to supplement their income, minimal marketing support, and sparse media coverage. They accepted these conditions because they loved the game and because the league framed sacrifice as solidarity. We're all in this together. We're building something. Your time will come. Then Clark arrived. And her time came immediately. Overwhelmingly. Undeniably. And suddenly the gap between what players had been told they were worth and what the market was capable of paying became impossible to ignore. That's where the real anger lived. Not in one flagrant foul. Not in one social media comment. In the sudden, brutal clarity that the league had always had the capacity to invest more, in marketing, in salaries, in media presence, but had chosen not to until one player made it financially unavoidable. That realization created fractures. Some players used it as fuel. Aya Wilson, arguably the league's best player before Clark arrived, became more vocal about compensation, more public about the systemic inequities she'd experienced throughout her career. She channeled the moment into advocacy. Others fractured differently. The frustration became misdirected. Instead of pointing at the system that had undervalued them, some players pointed at the person who had exposed the undervaluation. Clark became the symbol of everything that felt unfair, even though she hadn't created any of it. She was just the mirror that showed everyone what the league had always been capable of doing and had always chosen not to do. That's a heavy thing to be, especially for a 22-year-old rookie trying to survive a professional season. And here's what makes Clark's response to all of it so remarkable in retrospect. She never broke. She never lashed out. She never used her platform to target anyone or demand special treatment. But she also never pretended the tension didn't exist. In rare unguarded moments, brief press conference answers, sideline reactions that cameras caught, you could see it. The awareness of being at the center of something much larger than basketball. The weight of representing a financial revolution that she didn't choose and couldn't control. But just when you think you understand this story, Just when the narrative seems to be settling into a clear shape, one final piece of information surfaces. Something that happened after the season ended. Behind closed doors. In a meeting that was never supposed to become public. A conversation that reveals exactly what the league's leadership actually thinks about everything that happened in 2024. And it will change how you see all of it. Here's what the WNBA doesn't want you to walk away thinking. They don't want you to see 2024 as a cautionary tale about what happens when money enters a sport that used to run on passion alone. They don't want you to notice the invisible system that ended 3 careers without a single official explanation. They want you to see a league that's finally thriving, growing, becoming what it always deserved to be. And here's the most complicated part of everything we've covered today. They're not entirely wrong. The WNBA is growing. Attendance numbers are historic. Broadcast deals that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago are now reality. Young girls across the country are watching women's basketball for the first time and seeing something worth believing in. That's real. That matters. And it shouldn't be dismissed. But growth built on a foundation of invisible punishments, institutional silence, and market forces that operate without accountability or transparency isn't the kind of growth that sustains itself. Eventually, systems that run on unspoken rules create unspoken resentments. And unspoken resentments become very spoken problems. The meeting that happened after the 2024 season ended, the one that was never supposed to go public, reportedly involved league leadership, select team owners, and player representatives from the union. The agenda, according to sources close to the situation, wasn't about rule changes or officiating standards or collective bargaining. It was about narrative control. Specifically, how to manage the public perception of everything that had happened throughout the season. How to frame the DeShields situation, the Carter situation, the Swoopes commentary, without ever officially acknowledging what the market had actually done to those women. How to protect the financial momentum of the Clark era while quietly ensuring that the players who'd threatened it understood their careers had permanent consequences. The outcome of that meeting produced no public statement, no policy announcement, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. Just more silence. Deliberate, calculated, institutional silence. And that tells you everything about where power actually lives in this league. Not with the players who built it. Not with the veterans who sacrificed overseas seasons and below-market salaries to keep it alive during the dark years. With the owners, the sponsors, the broadcast partners, and the market that serves all of them simultaneously without ever needing to show its face. So what happens now? Diamond DeShields is still working to get back into the league. Still training. Still believing that her talent is enough to overcome what the market decided about her. Maybe it will be. Talent has a way of forcing its way back into conversations. Kennedy Carter is navigating the same invisible barriers. The same closed doors and unanswered calls that follow players who've been marked by the system. Cheryl Swoopes continues to speak. Continues to share her perspective on women's basketball with the authority of someone who lived its history from the inside. But the platforms available to her now are smaller than what she once commanded. And Caitlin Clark? She's preparing for her second WNBA season, carrying the weight of a financial revolution she didn't ask for and can't put down. Here's the final truth that this entire story points toward. The WNBA is at a crossroads that its leadership hasn't publicly acknowledged yet. It can use this moment of unprecedented growth to build something genuinely equitable, better salaries, transparent processes, real accountability for how players are treated both on and off the court. Or it can use the market to maintain a hierarchy that serves owners and sponsors while asking players to accept whatever the invisible system decides their careers are worth. The difference between those two paths isn't just moral. It's practical. Because leagues that protect their financial assets without protecting their players eventually discover that players are the asset. Not the revenue. Not the broadcast deals. Not the sponsorship packages. The women on that court. Every single one of them. Not just the one that everyone is watching. That's the lesson of 2024. Whether anyone in power is willing to learn it remains the only question that actually matters going forward. And the answer to that question will determine whether what's happening in women's basketball right now becomes a genuine revolution, or just the most profitable version of the same old story. The court is set. The players are watching. And the WNBA's next move will tell you exactly which future it's chosen.